Hey folks, it's Milan again, the LSAT tutor. Thanks for checking out this video. And in this video, we're going to be talking about some of the best practices for learning LSAT material and working on the execution, doing it under test conditions. This is a continuation. This is part two of another video that I had about setting up your study schedule. This one is going to go a little bit more in depth in the overall structure and what that would look like. Okay, so basically, in this cover, we're gonna go over how to learn the material, what's the appropriate structure of your overall test prep process, and how we're going to practice it. So, how do you go about working under test conditions? Essentially, just to give you a kind of basic point of the video, I recommend starting with the basics of verbal reasoning, then going to the reading comprehension passages, then games, then arguments, and then finally back to the reading comp questions. Then, once your understanding is there, once you've covered all of that, understood it, you want to do full sections, first untimed, then timed, and then at the end, you're going to move on to take full tests. All right, so and once again, as usual, before we jump into this, please make sure to like, subscribe, comment, etc. It really helps, and check out my site for more articles and videos like this, and along with over 20 hours of completely free LSAT instruction. Okay, so first thing, learning the material. Where do we start? How do we progress? Essentially, like I said, the progression I follow starts with reading comp passages, then the games, then the arguments, and then back to the reading comp questions. Well, actually, there's an introduction to verbal reasoning before the reading comp passages. So, as I mentioned, it's important to start with building a strong foundation in verbal and logical reasoning. Now, this is going to help you understand what an argument is, how to reason logically, particularly conditional reasoning. I always cover that first. Make sure students understand that. And all of this is fundamental because the verbal reasoning, the argumentative, elements to this understanding of how arguments work. This is key for both the argument section, the logical reasoning section. I refer to it colloquially as the argument section. So both for that section and for the reading comprehension. The conditional stuff, I also cover conditional reasoning, is also very important for across all three sections. To be honest, a bit less so for the reading comp, but for the arguments, definitely, and certainly for the games. So this usually takes around 2 to 4 hours where you're going to be working on various prep materials and exercises. And so I won't be mentioning any specific prep materials. You can look at my site where I basically have a lot of videos that cover all the stuff we're talking about, but any decent prep material out there is going to cover all of this as well. So whatever you're using, whatever you've been working with. Okay. Next, you want to move on to the reading comprehension passages. Initially, what you'll do is you'll focus on understanding the structure of the passages. So you're going to learn how to read closely, and that's very important because that's how you're going to understand all of these complex texts. So at this point, you'll be spending roughly, or you're going to spend roughly 6 to 10 hours on this phase, and you're essentially going to learn the framework for reading the passages and then read a bunch of different passages to get understanding of that framework. After that, you want to move on and learn about the game fundamentals and the various game types. Now, the thing is, this is the analytical reasoning section. The thing with me is that I teach a slightly different approach from the conventional games approach where you're making deductions. My approach, my approach centers on learning a mechanical step-by-step process for the questions. And so in this particular first part, the 10 to 15 hours, what you're doing first, you're just learning about the logic games and you're learning how to identify the key components of a game. And you're also going over the various or the different basic game variations. Once you've got that down, or rather, it'll take about 10 to 15 hours. And one thing I wanted to mention, actually, I forgot to mention, during this period, you're going to keep reading the comprehension passages, reading comprehension passages. So the initial 6 to 10 hours was to get a foundation in that, and then as you're moving through everything, you're reading passages on a daily or, several times a week, whatever you have the time for, but you want to maintain uh, just working through reading the passages and getting good at understanding them and understanding the structure and the connections in them. Okay. So after you're done with the fundamentals and game types for their analytical reasoning for the games, the focus is then going to shift to understanding the different types of game questions and how to approach them. And this is the core of my games approach. And at this point, this stage takes about 20 to 40 hours. This is the most time consuming for the games. You're looking at the different questions, you're learning how to approach them, and then you're just practicing a lot of questions. And as I mentioned, you want to keep practicing reading comprehension passages as you're working through all of this material. Okay. Once you've got a good handle on the questions for the games, you then move on to the argument section, the logical reasoning section. This involves understanding the different types of questions that you're going to encounter and how to approach them. And the way you do it, you start by practicing each question type separately, and then you want to combine as you're moving through the different question types. In my videos, if you take a look at my site, I divide them into basically three or four, let's say three different types of questions, and then you learn a question type or three categories of question types. You learn a question type, you learn the three or four that are in that category, and then I combine them. So you're working on three or four different question types at a time. And this is also going to be a big part of your overall study process. It takes about 20 to 40 hours to get through all the different question types and get the exercises in to understand them. And as I mentioned, as with the other parts, throughout this process, throughout going through the arguments, you should continue practicing reading and comprehension. You want to make sure it's balanced. And then in addition to reading comp, you're also going to introduce doing full games but untimed. So this way, what you're doing is you're actually working on everything as you're moving forward. You get a foundation of the reading comp, you're reading passages and as you're doing games, and then the same thing with the games, you get a foundation of that, you move on to doing full games, but untimed, that's important. You want to do untimed games as you're learning the arguments. Next, you're going to focus on reading comprehension to learn about the different types of questions and the various strategies for answering them. So I leave that for the end because the difficulty with the reading comprehension is actually the passage. The questions aren't as difficult, particularly if you do it after you learn the arguments questions. So you want to make sure that you've uh, read a bunch of passages and you're going to practice answering question types on their own before tackling full passages. So you'll be doing specific types of questions. A little bit more difficult with this because it's a long passage for a specific question type, but you can do that to get you, to you, what you'll do is you'll learn or you'll have an exercise set. You'll do practice of a specific question type from the reading comp section just to get a handle on it. But it's okay if you once you learn the material for that, you start doing just the passages with all of the questions combined. Like I said, particularly after you've done the argument section, these aren't very difficult. And this is going to take around 6 to 10 hours of work. Now, like I said, this is based on the way that I teach the games. Um, Optionally, your study schedule can also incorporate combination of studying for the games and the arguments simultaneously. And this is as opposed to sequentially the way I do it. This can be a little bit easier if you're doing the more conventional approach, where you're focusing on different game types. So you can break it up into different game types, and then you'll have a session the next day on argument types, and you can alternate between game types and argument question types. And the variety may maybe make it a little bit easier to maintain discipline. But I found that just in my experience, it's perfectly fine if you do it sequentially, as long as you do it in such a way where you're learning the foundation and then you're practicing what you're learning as you're learning or you're practicing what you've learned as you're learning the materials from the next section that you do. Okay, so that's basically how I would structure how to learn the material. And by that, what I mean is just going through the prep books and understanding the concepts and understanding what you're doing when you're approaching the questions. Now, learning to execute. So how do you put everything together and how do you translate your skills to the test? So basically, as you get closer to the end of, of your LSAT study, it's important to do timed practice. So at this point, you should have learned all about the different kinds of questions and how to do them and should be fairly comfortable with the questions. Now it's time to put all of that together to by taking time sections and then taking full tests. So you can basically choose to focus on one type of section or a couple of different types of sections during a specific study session. So you can have a study session where you're doing just timed games or you're doing just timed arguments. Or you can split it up and do a section of games, section of arguments, or reading comp or whatever it might be. Basically, the goal at this stage is to try to do as many questions, regardless of whether you're doing a session with just one section type or a couple. The goal is to try and do as many questions appropriately. So don't rush to do as many as you can and try to get it right. The point is to implement what you've learned. So you want to do it appropriately. You definitely don't try to finish the whole section if you're rushing too much. You want to get to the point where you're getting most, if not all of the ones that you get to correct. Now, obviously, you want to do it in such a way where you're trying to get to a lot of questions. You don't want to spend 20 minutes or 10 minutes on one question. You're trying to do it at, let's say, 5 to 10% faster than you feel perfectly comfortable, but you don't want to sacrifice understanding for speed because speed is going to come through developing your understanding and developing your rhythm. So once you are, as I was saying, um, you get to the point where you're getting most of the ones that you get to correct, then the whole point after that is going to be on maintaining that accuracy as you get to more and more questions. And that comes through primarily developing a better understanding, just doing more questions, developing a better rhythm, and slowly increasing your tempo and training yourself just to think a little bit faster and work a little bit faster. So accuracy and then speed follows from that. And then this, like I said, this takes anywhere from 20 to 60 hours. So this is going to take, this is essentially the second half of the approach. What you're doing is you've learned everything and now you're doing time sections. Don't do full tests, just do individual sections where you are starting with high accuracy and then moving on to increasing your speed while maintaining your accuracy. Okay, so when you've comfortably started getting to all of the questions or most of all of the questions in the time sections in isolation, and you're accurate, you maintain your accuracy is good, it's time to put all of that together and move on to taking full tests. And you want to take at least 20 time tests. So you're taking full tests under time conditions. You're doing, four sections. If you're adding a experimental section, let's say four sections. You don't have to do five sections. That's four sections. You're doing it under time conditions. 35 minutes a section. There's can't go forward, can't go back, etc. So you know all of that stuff from the way that the test is structured. And like I said, you need to do a bunch of these, at least 20, if you want to see some real improvement. So it's best to, like I said, simulate the actual test environment during the sessions. And then when you're done, you want to make sure to review your mistakes. At this point, if you've done a bunch of timed sections individually, the errors that you make are most likely going to be execution errors, and that really is a question of practice, because what that is you're essentially going through the you're going through doing the test and trying to maintain engagement and focus, and that the only way that you can train yourself to do that is by doing enough tests. Okay. um, a very important point, it's very important to give yourself enough time to prepare. So as you can see by the amount of tests that you have to take, plus the amount of hours that it generally takes to get through all of this, it takes quite a bit of time. Usually, people spend, with my students, I like to have at least 3 months studying for the test. But obviously that depends on the individual, and you can adjust that depending on your schedule and how much time you have. But keep in mind, it takes a while. Now, if you're short on time, one helpful thing to do is to take practice tests while you're still learning. So this will help you work on your execution, training you to apply what you're learning under those conditions. Ideally, you want to first learn the concepts and then learn how to apply them. But if you're short on time, you have to sacrifice somewhere. So then it's important to have experience with the actual test. You want to take some tests, even if it means uh, not not spending as much time doing the exercises and the drilling, because that's just an important part of doing well on the test. And likewise, in order to save time, you might skip some of the practice drills that include mixed question types, or timed section practices if you're short on time. So just learn the material, learn the questions individually, and then just start taking full tests. And by taking full tests, you'll be practicing under test conditions. So the time section practices, although ideal, if you're running short on time, might as well just go straight to taking full tests. Um, and likewise with doing mixed exercise sets, once again, ideally you want to do that so that you have a better understanding of the material and the concepts and how to approach them. But sometimes you don't have the time, so you'll want to start taking tests a little bit earlier and skip some of those types of drills. However, obviously, this approach means that you're sacrificing that depth, so you have to keep that in mind. Once again, like I said, ideally you want to always give yourself plenty of time, which is a minimum of 3 months in my experience for somebody that's new to the test. Okay, so to quickly recap, the schedule that I follow with students roughly starts with verbal reasoning and reading comprehension, then move on to games, then finally arguments, going back to the reading comp to learn the questions. So make sure to continue working things as you learn them, or to put that a little bit more accurately, once you've learned them, as you're learning new material, make sure that you are reviewing and doing everything that you've learned up to that point. And as you get closer to the end of your LSAT study, you've covered everything, you've learned everything, you got to do time practice. Put everything together by taking time sections and then full tests. Okay, so thanks for watching my video. And like I said, feel free to check out my site for more of these videos and articles, along with I've got 20 hours of completely free LSAT prep that might give you some ideas in terms of how to approach this stuff. Okay, all the best on the LSAT.